Friday night games in the Pac-12. Certainly, the Pac-12 plays more Thursday and Friday games than the other four conferences possibly combined. I know the ACC dips into
ACC
that
is the other
pool.
one. But
Yeah,
yeah, you don't see much in the Big 12, SEC, or Big 10. It's the Pac and the ACC, really.
which is a good move in regards to national exposure. You have exclusive windows there.
Absolutely. I mean, the main thing is, USC fans are well aware of, being brutally treated in terms of Friday night games. The ultimate example was several years ago when USC played Texas in a nationally televised Saturday game that went to overtime, and USC had to play at Washington State the week after. Like, that was horrible because, USC was playing a high-end opponent one week and then had the weeknight road game the next week. Now here, you have a home game against Cal and then a Friday night game against Colorado. That's fine. Like, USC's not being meaningfully disadvantaged, but that Texas-Washington State short week several years ago, Alabama, Oklahoma, Ohio State would never, ever, ever be treated that way. So that's a sore spot. And Mark, so like we were talking about scheduling Friday night games, time slots, kickoff times, perfect segue into the other really big topic that I wanted to hit on here at the Voice of College Football. So for USC fans who didn't catch the news earlier on Monday, there's been a 6-day hold for Showdown Saturday, the two big games, USC, UCLA, Utah, Oregon. All right. That in itself is not a surprise. The networks obviously want to wait to see what happens this weekend. They want it to be official that those two games are going to have maximum value. That's not a problem. That's not a surprise. But here's the problem. All right. The Fox and ESPN, who have final say on this, and that's part of the problem in the Pac-12, of course, giving the networks too much leverage in all of this. It's been announced that one of those two games is going to be 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 Eastern on Fox. The other one at 7:30 Pacific, that's 10:30 Eastern on ESPN. All right, so let's just process that for a moment. First off, the ESPN, if it does carry, ESPN will carry one of the two games at 10:30 Eastern. So that means Chris Fowler is not going to be calling that game. He calls the primetime game, or he might call Illinois, Michigan. Chris Fowler has called a few day games earlier this season. He called the Ohio State, Michigan State game earlier this season. That was a day game. So Fowler's not going to call USC, UCLA. He has not called a single USC game this year. Like, that's a shocker. You certainly would have thought that Chris Fowler was going to call at least one Lincoln Riley USC game. So we're going to get through the UCLA game without him making a single call. And we don't know the television situation yet for the Notre Dame game 1 week later. So that's one thing. But here's here are the bigger problems. One is that imagine USC, UCLA in a year when both teams are really good, playing for a spot in the Pac-12 championship game, most likely, and you're dumping that late at night when the East Coast is not going to see it or is not going to stay up for it. You're going to do that to USC, UCLA when the rivalry is good. I mean, we've suffered through so many unremarkable, unimportant nationally USC, UCLA games over the past decade and a half. And the year when they're finally good, like, this is going to be the biggest USC, UCLA game since 2005, when UCLA and USC both entered that game with no more than UCLA, I think, had one loss and USC was unbeaten. Biggest USC, UCLA game in 17 years. And if it's on ESPN, it gets dumped late at night. That is just absolutely horrible. And then for our Oregon fans and our Utah fans who are watching here on the Voice of College Football, let's say USC, UCLA gets the primetime game on Fox. It's the same thing for the Utes and the Ducks. Utes, Ducks, a 10:30 Eastern kick. So, like, you're guaranteed to have at least one of those two huge games dumped in the late night slot. That is abominable. That is atrocious. And given the time slots that I mentioned, one game at 5, one game at 7:30, there's overlap. So the second game is going to be starting when the first game is going to be late in the third quarter. So, like, even if you are wanting to watch both games, you're going to have to miss one of them, a quarter and a half of the second game, so that you watch the end of the first one, assuming it's competitive. Just a total disaster. Like, You couldn't even have the earlier games start at 4 with the late game starting at 7:30 Pacific time. You couldn't even have a 3.5 hour separation. It's just a 2.5 hour separation. My goodness, just a total disaster for what was supposed to be, this huge day for the Pac-12. One game's just going to be in the middle of the night, and there's going to be overlap between the two games. Just a total train wreck, and a reminder of how bad this television deal was, in terms of not locking in certain contractual protections. So ESPN, Disney, they are not contractually mandated to have a certain amount of 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific games. And Mark, as a college football historian, as do I, that classic college football, old time religion was Michigan, Ohio State at noon, USC, UCLA at 3:30. Played in bright California sunshine with Keith Jackson, Frank Broyles, in that brilliant light. That's when the USC UCLA game at its best, and certainly when the rivalry was elite and nationally important. You play it in the daytime. So, this is just a total gut punch, and yet, it's the 78 trillionth reminder of why USC and UCLA are moseying on off to the Big Ten.
Wow, a lot of things come to mind here. The first one would be, I wonder who between Fox and ESPN has the selection to make, because I would think that network would take USC, UCLA.
Probably. But I don't know if, in terms of Fox and ESPN, which network has first pick. I guess that since the primetime slot belongs to Fox, I guess one would think in a rational world that Fox does get the first choice. But this isn't rational. Nothing about this does make sense. So I would lean toward that interpretation, but I don't know that for a fact. I do know that, with ESPN having the late night slot, you're not going to get a Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit. Now, by the way, it is technically true that ABC had a USC in primetime in week 2, but Reese Davis, not Fowler, called that game because Chris Fowler was calling the U.S. Open singles finals that weekend. So you can kind of say that's a technicality, but really, we were all expecting Chris Fowler to have a USC call by this point, and UCLA felt like a natural choice given how big this game is going to be. Nope, still not going to have one. And if you're USC, you counted on Lincoln Riley to give you this front stage visibility, and yet ESPN continues to marginalize USC like this. It's really a lot to digest, but all of it enormously frustrating.
And you wonder if ESPN is marginalizing USC and UCLA because of their move to the Big Ten, and they'll no longer be on their network. So why not get a jump start on lessening the brand as much as they can possibly control?
This is how conspiracy theories are allowed to continue, much like Pac-12 refs. When you continue to see horrible episodes, that's how conspiracy theories continue. And may I mention Michael Mothershed, the Pac-12 head official who mangled the USC Arizona game. He mangled the Oregon State Washington game this past Friday, called 12 men on the field when there were just 11. He said it's the end of the first half when actually it was just the end of the first quarter. They called targeting on the wrong guy. And this is the same guy who just, completely mishandled the USC Arizona situation. So, just like no one's minding the store, no quality control, no supervision. Hello, administrators. Anybody home? Anybody minding the fort? Nope. And this is how conspiracy theories persist.
The one thing I will say about the scheduling of the games that seems unique to the Pac-12 and the West Coast is that the other time zones and those conferences that are related to those time zones obviously look at primetime games as being the ultimate, as being the prize. This is where you usher the games to. primetime. Now, that's been changed and altered to a certain extent by Fox initiating the big noon kickoff and countering what ESPN and ABC do in primetime. And we've actually seen some marginalized primetime games on ABC in recent weeks with the likes of Minnesota and Penn State. And there have been a few others, Clemson and Boston College. But again, primetime is where it's at. That said, that's an East Coast primetime slot. That's there's overlap and doesn't work out perfectly in terms of time zones, but that's kind of a Midwest time slot as they go into Central Time and so forth. The West Coast, however, you would think most of the viewership for those two games that you're talking about are going to come from the Pacific time zone. Therefore, you would think that there would be some cachet or some relevance and some benefit to playing prime time in the Pacific time zone, because that's where most of the viewership theoretically should come from.
And I think that works early in the season, when the whole national focus isn't revolving around a select few games. The earlier weeks of a college football season, especially if you don't have like a huge national showdown between top teams like Notre Dame, Ohio State, week 1, like that's kind of the exception to the rule. But for the most part, in the early weeks with non-conference games, a lot of them unremarkable. Yeah, like having more late games to showcase Western teams and it being the early in the season and fans wanting to see what their teams look like. That makes sense. But gosh, USC UCLA used to be a national event, as I remarked earlier. And so having that prominent in the middle of the day so that it doesn't get kicked late, that's one thing. And the other thing is the College Football Playoff Committee. Whether you think USC or UCLA are likely to get in the playoff, that's secondary. It's just the fact that those two teams are in playoff consideration. The winner of that game will be in the hunt for the playoff heading into the end of November and probably early December, playing most likely Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. So you want the committee and you want people in the East to see what is possibly your best team, what is possibly your conference champion, and therefore your main candidate for the playoff. You want to see the committee watching that game, and like there's no law or rule that says that the committee has to stay up until 2:15 a.m. Eastern time watching your game. It just invites the committee to give a little bit less attention to that. And so if this gets into a really close contest with Dabo Swinney and Clemson, and we know that the committee has made decisions based on TV, at least in part, in the past few years, it opens the door. It opens the door to conspiracy theories, and in a way that we didn't have to be here. So I go back to the point that just USC UCLA was always a daytime showcase when the rivalry was at its height, and there were a lot of great. For decades, it was an important game. It was an important game in '67 with Gary Beban and O.J. Simpson. It was important throughout the '70s, especially when Terry Donahue came to UCLA in the mid '70s, and he went against John Robinson. Had lots of really great games in the late '70s through 1981, and then you still had some moments in the late 1980s. With Donahue's teams going against those good Larry Smith teams. So for a few decades, like it was just appointment television. And it was, crucially, it was a part of college football culture to have that game played in the daytime. Like that was the time that conferred prominence on USC, UCLA, because it was late in the season, because the game mattered. So like late in the season, Mark, I think that, with the shorter days, we just had the time change, it gets colder and darker earlier. The idea that a game is played in the middle of the day in November, it's a very different dynamic compared to September when it's still light, pretty late in the day, and it doesn't carry the same psychological weight, that the November darkness does. So like that is another thing to recommend in terms of having USC and UCLA play in the daytime.